Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll be going over the history and geography of Cuba. Cuba, as you can see, is an island in the Caribbean. It is the largest island in the Caribbean. It is part of a little area known as the Greater Antilles, which consists of Cuba and Hispaniola, among other islands around here. Cuba, like I said, is the largest island in the Caribbean, but it's also made up of like thousands of other islands, and it has its own different archipelagos. You can see right here, Archipelago de Camagüey, Archipelago de los Jardines de la Reina, and Archipelago de las Camareos, where you can find the largest island, Isla de la Juventud, the Isle of Youth, basically. And Cuba is, of course, mostly known for its beautiful beaches. There are over 300 beaches on Cuba, and they're all spectacular. I tried to search what are the best, which is debatable, but for the most part, it's the beaches near Cienfuegos on the Caribbean side, although on the Atlantic side of Cuba there's also lots of good beaches, apparently especially around on the little islands. The capital of Cuba is Havana, which is located right up here. Cuba is sort of divided into three sections. There's this upper part, the middle part, and the lower part. The upper part has some really interesting mountains up here. There's a place called the Vinales Valley where there are huge karst mountains that just look like little round blobs of rock, basically. They're really neat. And since they're karst, they're very easy to erode. So there's lots of caves all throughout, and apparently those caves used to be homes for the first native peoples, and they were hideouts for runaway slaves and things like that. There's lots of history in those caves. Really, really neat. In the center area, it's a little flatter. This peninsula here has a big marshland known as the Zapata Swamp, which I was like, why is it called the Shoe Swamp? You can't really tell from this map, but this whole peninsula is pretty much shaped like a shoe. It's really cool. That's also where the Bahia de Cochinos is, the Bay of Pigs, which anyone like me who's had to go through extensive U.S. history classes knows about that. There are some mountainy areas, and the central area is pretty much, since it's so narrow, it's mostly known for the beachy areas. And then down here in the south, it gets very mountainous, as you can see over here. The biggest, most famous range of mountains is right here. It is the Sierra Maestra. The highest peak is right about here. It is Pico Turquino. And you can also see over here is Guantanamo Bay, which is a United States military base. We'll obviously talk about that in its history. But for the most part, that's about it for geography of Cuba. It is an absolutely stunningly beautiful land. Getting a little ahead of myself, but when Christopher Columbus came on this island, he said it was the most beautiful place in the world, basically, in so many words. So I'll show you some fabulous pictures in this book after we go over its history, so let's get right into it. There were actually lots of interesting indigenous people who lived on the island, but the one we know the most about were the Taino. They arrived on Cuba about 5,000 years ago from South America and various other islands in the Caribbean here. And they were the people that Columbus came into contact with when he landed here in 1492. He claimed the land for Spain. The first settlement was established in 1511. What is now Havana was actually established in 1515. And, of course, the Spanish took the natives and forced them to mine for gold and worked them very cruelly and Many of them contracted smallpox and measles, which they had no immunity to. So once the workforce started to thin out, they started importing slaves from Africa, and a huge slave culture was implemented here. I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's obviously not enough gold here to extensively mine it, especially when you compare it to Mexico and lots of other places that they had claimed around Central and South America. So Cuba was essentially used as a base for the Spanish. Like when they sailed from Spain, they would land here, get everything ready, and then go on to Mexico or South America or Florida, wherever their mission took them. But they did have extensive sugar plantations throughout Cuba, which they obviously used that slave labor for. But yeah, like I said, it was kind of like the way station for the Spanish. It wasn't totally significant compared to a lot of their other territories. Lots of pirate activity around this area, of course. Pirates attacking the Spanish. And in 1762, the British actually invaded. They were fighting a war with Spain. They decided to take that fight to the Caribbean and take over their island. The following year, they gave the island back to Spain in exchange for Florida, which is why Florida is now part of the United States. So like I said, slavery was very strongly maintained on this island, especially during lots of the upheavals happening in this corner of the world. Haiti declared its independence. There was a huge slave revolt, which established a black country, essentially the first ever black controlled country, which made Cubans pretty nervous. Many countries all throughout Central America started declaring their independence from Spain, made Cuba pretty nervous. So it's like they went all in on the slavery plantation thing, even though there were extensive slave revolts and things like that. But slavery did not really technically end until 1886, which is quite a long time, considering everything else that was happening in the world, where slavery had been abolished in so many other places. But the call for independence actually began in 1868, and it had a little bit to do with slavery. The guy who led it, Céspedes, was a plantation owner, I believe, but he freed all his slaves. He said, Cuba's going to be independent, let's fight. And the main star of this era was José Martí, who led a big push for independence and died on the battlefield in 1895. This led to the Spanish really cracking down on Cubans to make sure that the revolt was suppressed as much as possible. Up in the United States, they were reporting all of these horrors, which there were horrors happening in Cuba, don't get me wrong. Apparently, the concentration camp was invented at this time on Cuba. So there were very terrible things happening on Cuba. But the United States tried to, exaggerate it as much as possible to sell newspapers, because it was that era of journalism. So people got very concerned up in the United States about human rights down here in Cuba. A battleship was sent over in 1898 just to kind of check on things. It was the USS Maine, and it exploded one night. No one knows why to this day. It's believed to have been some kind of fire down in the galley. But many people passed away during the explosion, and the US immediately blamed Spain, saying that Spain blew it up. Of course, Spain denied it. It's a 99% chance Spain did not do it, let's be real. But that led to the Spanish-American War. Americans invaded. That's where we get the Battle of San Juan Hill, led by Teddy Roosevelt. Again, if you sat in extensive American history classes like I did, you know the American angle in Cuban history. It's been pretty refreshing researching this and not looking at it through an American lens for once. But yeah, that was that era. The war ended with Spain giving Cuba to the United States, along with Puerto Rico over here and Guam and the Philippines over there. Since obviously Cuba wanted its independence, the US made it a protectorate for a few years, and then they granted it independence in 1902, with a couple of little caveats, one of which was the Platt Amendment, which allowed the United States to have a military base at Guantanamo Bay, which it is still there to this day. We'll probably talk about that more in a minute. So the early government in Cuba was pretty rocky. The most infamous person during this era was Fulgencio Batista. In 1933, he overthrew the current government to put himself as president. And once he decided to have another term in 1944, it looked like he was losing the election, so he organized another coup so he could have another go at being president. A very unpopular guy, you can imagine. So some rebellions started to spark up, mainly among the communists, since Batista had outlawed communism in Cuba. So the big proponents of this revolution were two brothers named Fidel and Raul Castro. That revolution began in 1956. They very famously sailed their ship from Mexico, the Granma, landed over here, and basically fought their way up the island until they reached Havana in 1959 and essentially took over the government. And, looking at it from a Cuban angle, it's seen as this glorious revolution, right? Obviously. But it was pretty rough in terms of the people who were in power. It really didn't matter your stance. If you were in power, you were taken out, out of this planet, out of your life. Many, many people lost their lives during the revolution just because they were at the wrong place at the wrong time, or they had a certain position in the government. You were done. So the country was taken over by the communists. He went full communist starting in the early 1960s, especially after the Bay of Pigs incident, which was when America attempted to invade Cuba to take out Fidel Castro, which failed horribly. All the soldiers involved were either killed or captured. So that's when Cuba really became buddies with the USSR. And that's what led to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when American intelligence found out that Russian missiles were being stored on Cuba, which, could have very easily led to World War III. Apparently, it was very close to happening, but the Soviets and the United States negotiated. Cuba was caught right in the middle, Cuba was pretty busy during these years. They actually sent troops all around the world to fight for communist causes in lots of countries in Africa, mainly Angola, but also in Ethiopia and Guinea, among many others. They helped fight against Israel and Syria. They sent troops to Yemen. They had a lot of assistance for many countries who wanted help from the communists. Basically, they were there for that until the USSR broke up, and that led to some pretty devastating economic effects in Cuba. Lots of shortages and things like that. They did eventually receive aid from China and other sympathetic countries like Venezuela and Bolivia. It's also during this time that a lot of Cubans started to flee to the United States, which you can see is just up here. It's not too far away. There are obviously many Cubans who left during the revolution. So even to this day, Florida has a massive Cuban population. But this is when a very big exodus of people trying to sail or even swim to the United States to escape from Cuba really started. And eventually, once that era started to cool down and things, slowly got back to normal as they were in Cuba, Fidel Castro stepped down in 2008, citing health reasons. He put his brother Raul in charge. And in 2014, actually, the U.S., led by President Obama, started to negotiate with Cuba. During all this time, there were a lot of very strict embargoes, very strict embargoes placed on Cuba by the US. So, no imports, no exports, no cigars, basically no tourism from the US. And it's like Cubans didn't want them, Americans didn't want people going to Cuba. Guantanamo Bay being a big point of contention, not just because it's Americans, but it's also became like a prison for terrorists and kept in really questionable conditions. So the fact that the United States started opening up to Cuba during this time was pretty monumental. It's still not 100%, it's still pretty tense, but it's not nearly as tense as it used to be, especially in the 1960s, obviously. In 2019, Cuba got to elect its first president. His name's Miguel Diaz-Canel. And essentially that's where Cuba is today. It's still a bit rocky politically, but, not as horrific as it could be, I suppose. It's very interesting. I actually had a friend who got to visit Cuba. I'm American, so that was a big deal. It was like right after they lifted the tourism embargo that she got her tickets and went, like almost like the week that Americans were allowed to visit. And she obviously, she had no internet. She had to bring cash only because her cards wouldn't work, things like that. So I didn't hear from her for like 2 weeks. It was radio silence. She came back with the most stunning pictures. Like, they literally looked like photos that were taken 50 years ago. They looked super old-fashioned because all the buildings, all the cars and everything were from 50 years ago. It hasn't been updated since then. They haven't been able to. So it was so unreal to look at pictures taken in 2015 that looked like pictures taken in 1960. It was wild, and of course she said it was fantastic and beautiful, and one of the best trips she ever took. So anyway, that's Cuba. Let's look at some pictures in the book. Show you this really fascinating country. See, like, here's the cars they have. It's still very old-fashioned. It's a very jolly looking guy. Here we can see the Jose Marti Memorial. He's basically the national hero. Basically, he is the national hero, let's be real. Physical map of Cuba. You can see all the major cities. I didn't point out major cities. Sorry about that. I knew I was forgetting something in geography. But obviously, I have Havana. There's also Santiago de Cuba. There's Camagüey, Santa Clara, Cienfuegos, among many others. There's La Visa Rock, by the way, which has some really interesting, archaeology to it. It's really cool. Another picture of Jose Marti doing his thing. He was a poet before he was a revolutionary. Writing patriotic poems. Gorgeous beaches. The most beautiful country. As Columbus said. This is the Isla de Juventud. And a physical map. So you can see a lot more of the mountain chains down here, the bays, lots of natural harbors all around the main island. Lots of other smaller islands too. The Sierra Maestra Mountains, really beautiful. And here's those karst mountains I told you about. They're called mogotes. And they're really unusual looking. See Guantanamo Bay, the military base from the U.S. Here's the Zapata Swamp. Kind of looks like the Everglades in a way. Some of the interesting caves in Cuba. Ooh, look at this. So, let's see. We have, this is San Pedro de la Roca del Morro Castle. An old Spanish fort. And this is Camagüey. Very colorful. They've got a big old piece of bread there. It's huge. Very rainy day. Obviously, you're in the Caribbean. Alexander von Humboldt, who was like a naturalist who came in to the Caribbean and South America and cataloged lots of animals and things like that. After a hurricane. Very sad. It's Hurricane Sandy, it says. Very beautiful little hummingbird there. The national tree is the royal palm. A beautiful waterfall. It says this is near Cienfuegos. Gorgeous. This tree apparently is El Templete, or the building is called that, but there's this tree here where the Spanish first met to organize the country. So people go there and walk around it for good luck. The national flower, the white ginger lily, very beautiful. This is a drawing of a solenodon, which is like a kind of like a rodent-y kind of mammal, but he's poisonous, and yeah, he very nearly went extinct at one point. We've got a hutia, which is a kind of rodent that lives in the Caribbean. Looks just like a shrunken down capybara. We've got a mongoose that was introduced to help control some of the rats, which, really backfired since mongooses are pretty hazardous to the environment. Isn't this the cutest bird you've ever seen? It's a Cuban toddy. Absolutely adorable. Here's the national bird, though. It's the tocororo, or the Cuban trogon. It's got those beautiful colors, the Cuban flag, and a big old butterfly. Now, I reminded myself there is a snake on the next page, so if you're sensitive to that, just wait 1 second, I'll tell you when it's gone. So here we go. I think it's beautiful, though. This is a Cuban boa. I think it's very sweet looking. And here's a big crocodile, of course, big chomper. Alright, the snake is gone. Wonderful drawing of how it used to look on Cuba, all jungly forested. Map of the native people, so the Siboney you can see lived up here. The rest was pretty much the Taino people, and this also shows all of their settlements. Columbus meeting the natives here in this drawing. It's a statue of Hatsue, who resisted the Spanish invasion. He was kind of awesome. And a drawing of Havana back in the 1500s. Some pirates ramming into a ship here. Big headache for the Spanish. Here's Carlos de Cespedes announcing that all the slaves are freed and it's time for revolution. Here's a sugar plantation. And the Jose Marti Memorial again. Here's Teddy Roosevelt going over San Juan Hill. Pretty much like the event that led him to becoming president. Let's see, U.S. troops in Cuba in 1906. And this guy is named Carlos Finley, and he discovered that yellow fever was caused by mosquitoes. It's a map of the Cuban Revolution. So I forgot to mention Che Guevara was there too. The Castro brothers and Che Guevara and 40 other revolutionaries sailed on the Granma, landed here, fought some battles, marched their way up to Havana. There's Che right there. 1959 in Havana. Che Guevara, like I said, helped out the revolution, and so did Celia Sanchez. Apparently helped with the landing of the Granma also. So apparently this picture shows some farmers who are learning how to read, since there is a big literacy campaign in the new government. Here's the Bay of Pigs incident. And here's Fidel Castro with Khrushchev being BFFs. The Cuban Missile Crisis, people watching President Kennedy, hoping that the world's not going to end. And this is a U.S. ship escorting, wow, try that sentence again, a U.S. ship escorting a Soviet ship carrying away the missiles out of Cuba so that there's no nuclear war. People harvesting some sugar cane, so apparently, I'm pretty sure this is still how it goes, but not positive that, at least back in the day, that everyone had a day where they had to go on the collective farms and work all day. I think that's still how it goes, but I don't think it's as laborious as it was before. There's Fidel Castro speaking to the crowd out here. Some Cubans fleeing to the United States by boat. And here's Raul Castro. Some buildings, little derelicts. And wow, look at this picture. Looks like they're in like a Broadway show or something. Looks like they're about to burst out into song. Awesome. A Labor Day parade happening here. Lots of fun. The National Assembly. And the Chinese president at the time signing something with the country. Casting their vote. Very patriotic parade there. And there's actually a really good picture of Raul Castro. Let's read about Cuba's flag. The official banner of Cuba was designed in 1848 or 1849 by Narciso Lopez and Emilia Terbe Tolon. It consists of 3 horizontal blue stripes, 1, 2, 3, that represent the eastern, central, and western parts of the island nation. Between the blue stripes are 2 white stripes that stand for the purity of the cause of patriotism. A red triangle covers about a quarter of the flag, symbolizing the blood that was shed to free Cuba from Spain. The flag was adopted in 1902 when Cuba became independent from the United States. See all the different provinces on Cuba. And there's a map here of Havana, which I like because you can kind of see Havana Harbor here, which is a really large harbor, but like on my map it looks like nothing. So that's why Havana was built where it was, because it has this massive natural harbor here. And this building was built to look like the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in the United States. I think it's like a museum now. Yeah, the headquarters of the Cuban Academy of Sciences. They're in a bread line, apparently. Seeing the sights. A little cart there. I feel like every major city has some kind of like tourist horse-drawn cart in a way, if they can, you know. A little market here. She's got some good veggies for sale. Their currency, they use the Cuban peso. This guy's about to drive his bus, it looks like. And a doctor. So Cuba has a really advanced medical sector with like really good health care, apparently. They send their doctors around the world to help out less fortunate countries. A resources map. So you can see all the different things that are grown, things that are mined, fish that are fished, and sugarcane. Which nowadays it's mostly coffee more than sugarcane is like the main export. That and tobacco. Cuban cigars are like iconic. Socialismo muerte, says Fidel there. And he's, wow, look at his hands. Oh, it's huge. Carving up some limestones. It's a very bustling, busy day in La Habana. In Havana. Population map. So you can pretty much see it's pretty evenly spread out. You know, you can really see all the valley and like jungly forest areas. Obviously people don't live there, right? An Afro-Cuban person, a revolutionary fighter, Antonio Maceo, great mustache, a Taino woman, and a Chinese Cuban, because many people from China came over as like indentured servants and things like that. Enjoying the nice day. She's working hard in school here. El perro es muy lindo. Cute. Oh, it's time for communion, I suppose. Wearing her glasses. There's a little figurine of the Our Lady of Charity, who's like the saint of Cuba, the patron saint of Cuba. The Cathedral of Havana, really beautiful, beautiful old church, and their worship service. And he's practicing Santeria. A little procession there for a holiday. Another like Santeria little shrine ceremony happening there. Really interesting. And some more prayer. Ooh, Cuba has a really great ballet school and really fantastic dancers. Bartolome de las Casas, who was a priest you could see, who I think he was the one that wrote back to Spain and said, like, the native people here, like, being worked to death, like, we gotta stop this, and that allowed Spain to, like, issue laws to, like, stop doing that to the natives. Just do it to the African slaves. Poet Nicolas Guillen, I believe. Nancy Morejon, another poet from Cuba. The Art Museum, the Havana's National Museum of Fine Arts. Painter, Cuban heritage, Wilfredo Lam. And playing some lively drums here. Really into it. Celia Cruz, an icon. We love her. And here's a band performing timba music. This is La Charanga Habanera. Baseball is like the big sport in Cuba, and there are lots of Cuban players in the major leagues in the United States. Boxing too, this is Teofilo Stevenson. And of course swimming, and you're an island in the Caribbean, you gotta go swimming. And here's Ernest Hemingway, who lived on Cuba for quite a while. He wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls and The Old Man at the Sea while living in Cuba, and he had to leave during the revolution. Some wonderful faces there, school friends, wonderful family all together. There's a dice game called Subilete. I'm not sure, but it sounds like fun. It's kind of like Yahtzee, I suppose. Working hard in school, and she's ready for her quinceañera, her coming of age ceremony, and working hard in university. Ooh, some delicious fruit for sale here. Yum yum. We got some pork and fried plantains. Yummy yummy. And some corn fritters. Those look delicious. Some of the classic cars. Really beautiful too. And of course dancing is a huge part of Cuban culture. Like everyone dances. I think that's the end. Yeah, that's the end of our book. So thank you so much for watching. I'll have a whispered video about Cuba for you tomorrow, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Thank you again, and have a very good night. Good night.